Hello and welcome to my talk this afternoon. I'm very excited to be here at Scala Days and very excited to be able to share my experience of the lessons I've learned in my first year of Scala. So a bit of background on me. Hello, I'm Monica McGuigan. I'm a software engineer currently working for the financial services company JP. And specifically, I work in a data engineering team who provide a platform for authoring and understanding the bank's data and data models. And the back end is written predominantly in Scala. So before this, I was studying physics at university, and as part of my degree, I had the opportunity to complete an industrial placement between second and third year. And during this year, I worked in the same team that I'm in now, but back then I was predominantly a front-end engineer. So my coding up until that point had consisted of C#, C++, JavaScript, and TypeScript. So after this year, I went back to university, completed my degree, and graduated last summer. So, roll on starting a graduate job as a software engineer. As I said, I rejoined the team, but this time I was destined to be a back-end Scala engineer. So I've been writing Scala for just over a year now, and before this, I had hardly any Scala knowledge. I was very much a beginner. I could understand the kind of basic syntax, but no Scala knowledge. Irrespective of this, I was very much thrown in the deep end when I first started. So I had to get to grips very quickly with Scala, had to get to grips with understanding the libraries that my team used, and kind of understanding the platform that they were trying to build. So how did I work through this and learn Scala quickly and effectively enough in order to get me writing production quality code? When trying to answer this question, 3 key concepts kept coming up. So first was understanding that I would make mistakes and I had to take ownership for them in order to kind of grow and learn. Next was understanding how do I ask questions in a way to kind of help others help me. And finally, no developer is an island. Getting involved in the Scala community has taught me so much already, and is what led me to doing this talk today. So I'd like to share my experience and kind of how I saw things from my perspective, but also kind of what I wish senior developers had known. So first things first, at the very beginning of learning anything new, kind of goes without saying, you're going to make a lot of mistakes and probably feel like you don't know anything. Getting used to this feeling and being comfortable with failing is ultimately what will help you grow, and it really is an essential part of the learning journey of Scala. You'll learn a lot more from what you got wrong and how to correct it rather than what you got right first time. The more you experience, your learning will grow exponentially, and even at times, even if it feels the opposite, once you kind of start to reflect, you'll see how far you've grown. And so why am I a good person to kind of make this claim that you're going to make a lot of mistakes? Simply put, I have very much been that person, learning from scratch, making lots of mistakes. So when I first started, I was given a task where I had to write a function which had some fairly complex business logic in it, and at the end, I had to return a string value. So the way I like to write code is in a very iterative fashion, much the same as many other people. So I will write the code, and then I'll look back over it, see how I can optimize it. So I did the business logic, and at the end, when I was thinking, what do I want to return, I did a map of string to string. I think it's very obvious the kind of issue mistake in this piece of code. And it was only when I went to ask for feedback from a colleague that they were very quick to point out, why are you doing that? That is just identity. In Scala, the last line is taken as a return value. And I did this a couple of months ago. So even though I'm not a complete beginner anymore, I very much still make mistakes. I've learned from it. I understand why it was a mistake and hopefully won't repeat it. So this leads me into the next kind of point of the idea of a developer's rubber duck. So at the start, I found myself asking a lot of questions, only to find that the kind of like process of asking the question led me to seeing what the answer was. And this kind of led me into discussing with a team member where he told me the story of, on his first day of his computer science degree, the members of the department gave every student a rubber duck. And the sole purpose of the rubber duck was to sit on each student's desk and act as a sounding board. So they could kind of work through their problems and get to those solutions themselves. You'll be amazed at how much more clearly you can think when you have something or someone to talk to. So my advice to other junior developers is get a rubber duck, or have someone to kind of work your problems through with. So that's my advice to the kind of beginners. Now for the experienced developers in the room. So when you have new joiners join your team, it's inevitable that they'll take time to kind of adjust and ramp up their knowledge before becoming productive. And especially during this time for junior developers, let us fail. I know how tempting it is to kind of jump in immediately when we're working on a problem or we can't kind of get to a solution and jump in and try and solve those problems for us. And whilst this does show us your logic and your thought processes, we need to be able to develop and refine our own logic and thought processes. Allowing us to have the kind of time and space to fail allows us to kind of, develop a very strong foundation in problem solving, and it will pay dividends in the future when we become resilient and confident Scala engineers. So, following on from this, let us solve the easy problems. When I first started learning Scala, solving easy problems or implementing kind of small features to me felt like a massive win. And this went on to lead to a massive kind of confidence boost that meant I felt like I could tackle more and more complex problems as time went on. After kind of tackling the easy problems, I was able to start developing my runbook of how do you solve problems, what are the first steps that you take when you come up to a problem. And when you're kind of starting out in your first development job, understanding how do you do this takes time, and it's something that you'll achieve incrementally over time. And you need to kind of learn this about yourself in order to become a good software engineer. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, when I first started, I was very much thrown in the deep end in the first 2 months. And the first task I was given was to implement a new endpoint in our server. So, my manager very quickly worked out that how I like to learn is very much kind of jumping headfirst, tackling a problem, going straight in without learning all the theory behind it and kind of going as I go. So for him, implementing this endpoint probably would have taken him about a morning's work to write the codes, test it, deploy it, check it's all working. But for me, I had to learn, how does my team write endpoints? How do they use HTTP4S? Understanding where it sits in the ecosystem of our platform. And it took me over a month to kind of get this first Jira ticket or this first feature implemented, tested, and deployed. Giving me the time and space to learn this has been more valuable to me than having that code brought into production a month earlier. Advocating for me to have the time and space to kind of learn and understand this has given me such a solid foundation, and it's meant that I've built on this knowledge I learned in that first month over the past year, and I have a very solid technical foundation to kind of grow from. So that's a little on the importance of making mistakes and taking ownership for them. Next is, how do you help others to help you? So you've come across a problem as a junior developer and you don't really know how to proceed and you need to ask for help. How do you, as a junior person, kind of convey this in the best way and help others to help you? The answer to this question, I think, is rooted in sometimes an overlooked skill that's a part of our jobs, and that is effective communication. Being able to do this really well is going to make your life and learning journey a whole lot easier. So, how do you do this? How do you become a better communicator? I found when I was first starting out, a new job, a whole team of new people, a new platform that I had to work on, there was a massive information overload. And at the beginning, I'll be honest, there was times I felt very out of my depth. And when I was kind of reflecting on these first few months, I realized that I had to very quickly learn to discern between, is the problem I'm facing because I don't understand the context? I don't understand why we're doing what we're doing, or is it to do with the Scala? Like, how have we implemented this feature? Why is it done in that way? So when first asking for help, I started to kind of ask myself first, is it the context or is it the Scala? And I could frame my questions in this way in order to best maximize those interactions with other developers. So, first up, when you have a issue that's context, I have a bit of a checklist that I go through to kind of help increase my understanding. So first up is, probably not surprising, is docs. Always read the documentation before you go and ask anybody else for help. The last thing you want is the developer that you're asking for help to turn around and say, have you read the docs? And the answer is no. So cut out that unnecessary step and read the docs first. Next is, when it's code-based, I tend to kind of want to look at the entire PR of a feature. I find being able to see the entire change set and understanding, how does this bit of Scala, this bit of code work in the entire context of the change that's been made. This is a bit of a caveat that this only really works when your team writes good PRs. So make sure you have like full descriptions, screenshots where applicable. It's really helpful when you're a junior developer and you look at Git blame and you can actually see the PRs. So think about your future selves if you have to explain code to people or the junior developers joining your team. So finally, when I have a question about the kind of bigger picture, or I have a question, why do we do things in the way that we do? I tend to ask these during one-on-ones with senior developers or my manager. It helps me to really kind of pick their brains and ask the questions that sometimes you don't quite have time to when you're working on features. So, on the flip side, when it comes to the experienced developers, on the flip side, when your problem is to do with Scala, I again have a bit of a checklist that I go through. So, first up, again, this isn't going to be surprising. The first thing I check is the internet. When it comes to a very kind of generic Scala question, how do I implement this function from the standard library? The chances are that somebody somewhere will have asked it on, Stack Overflow or any of the other resources. Next port of call, for when this doesn't work, is asking one of the many talented developers that I work with. So this is where the kind of art and skill of communication really comes into play, and kind of how you clearly communicate the question you're trying to ask. It's very much a skill that takes active and intentioned practice. And at the very start, I used to have a bit of a bad habit of assuming that every developer that I worked with would know the answer to every question I had and would understand the context of everything that I worked on. And I would tend to kind of go into questions and give no context and just assume that they would be able to help me. Very unsurprisingly, this led to a very frustrating process back and forth, and I was left feeling like I didn't get the answer that I was looking for, or the question wasn't answered. So, to kind of make this process a little bit easier to combat this, I started phrasing my questions using this formula. So, first, I would give context. What part of the repository are you working on? What feature are you trying to implement? Next was, what is the goal of the code that you're trying to write? What are you actually trying to achieve? And then moving on to the question, so what do you actually kind of want out of this interaction? This could be things like, how do I make, I've got some code that works, how do I make it better? Or I don't understand how to do this. And finally, previous attempts. You should always attempt something first, and then go and see if you can get help. So, how do I actually put this into practice? So I had a bit of code that I had to write that was essentially a nested pattern match. And when I went to ask for kind of help on this piece of code that I wrote, I phrased my question in this way to try and best get my question answered. So first was the context. I said to the senior developer I was working with, I have this function which takes maybe foo and matches on it, and essentially pulls out the value of maybe bar. So I gave context to what I was doing, and then I explained the goal, which, as I said, was returning the value of maybe bar. The question I had to ask was, how do I make this more idiomatic? It works, but I don't think this is the best way to do it. And again, previous attempts, I showed them, this is what I've done. So when I asked a colleague, they suggested, instead of doing a nested pattern match, to flat map over maybe foo and then do a getter else on the optional maybe bar. This led to a lot more readable and kind of more idiomatic Scala codes. And I was left happy that I felt my question was answered, and it was a fairly painless process. Working on how you communicate with others is really key to getting the most out of the interactions with others and learning more effectively yourself. So, on to the other sides of these interactions with experienced developers. When we're asking for help, we're not looking for you to solve our problems for us. We're really trying to understand how do we develop and kind of hone that problem-solving runbook. And it's really, as I said, a skill developed over time. So as a senior developer, how do you help junior people to do this? So I've worked with developers that are really good at something called long-term laziness. So the idea is, they're able to teach the kind of steps of how you solve a problem rather than just doing it for me, so that next time when I come against the same kind of problem, I can do it myself without having to ask for help. So how do they practice long-term laziness? How do they get good at it? As I kind of said earlier about the developer's rubber duck, the first thing they would usually have me do is explain my problem, and majority of the time, as soon as I explained the problem, was able to solve it for myself. If that didn't work, the next kind of port of call would be to ask some leading questions. So things like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve with your codes? What have you changed? Even things that you don't think are related, what's your change set? And even small stuff like, is your code up to date with the remote? After these interactions, after asking these questions, there's usually kind of two outcomes that come from this. So the questions have kind of helped us to solve the problems by ourselves. The next, the questions have revealed a kind of lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding. You were able to help us correct it. We went away, we solved the problem. The important part of this is we were able to do this for ourselves. As I said, we're not looking for you to kind of do this for us, hence the term long-term laziness. Investing the time and effort up front will pay dividends in the future when you have very resilient and confident developers that can solve problems with minimal input from anybody else, or minimal input from kind of senior developers. So this kind of mostly goes without saying, but I think it's an important point. Not all new developers that will join your team are equal. There's really a variety of learning styles, and some who join will find, if they have kind of programming backgrounds, they might find functional programming very easy and pick it up very quickly. But others, maybe coming from a different background, will find the kind of shift in paradigm quite difficult. And I think this is extremely relevant because coming from a physics background and kind of coming from a non-traditional software background, coming into coding, how I solve problems and how I kind of tackle things is very different to my kind of thought processes and my logic that I run through. It can be quite different to computer science graduates. Understanding and appreciating these differences will allow you to kind of tailor your communication with not only the junior developers, but also with everybody else that you work with. So, this takes me on to the third part. So we've gone over making and owning mistakes. We've gone through kind of helping others to help you and how you best ask questions. And I want to touch on arguably what I think is the most important part, the community. Joining this community of Scala developers and what joins us all here together today. So, part of the reason why I've enjoyed learning Scala so much last year is I joined a team that has a lot of passionate, very talented Scala engineers, and they've made it really enjoyable to learn. It's also extremely comforting to know that you're not alone in your struggles, especially at the very beginning where it's quite a steep learning curve with Scala. And at one point, everybody has struggled to understand, type classes and implicits and ADTs. So, being a software engineer is so much more than just the functional Scala that you write. It's things like working with your IDE, making PRs, raising access requests, so much more than just the code. Learning all this and learning how to become a productive engineer, I've mostly learned through peer programming. Not all, but mostly through pair programming. So I'm sure everybody knows, but pairing where you're sat with another developer at one workstation working on a problem. And it does have its pros and cons. So having two developers working on one problem does not mean it's going to be solved in half the time. There's been plenty of times where I've been working on something with a senior developer and it's probably taken a lot longer than if they had just done it themselves. Pair programming is also not suitable for every problem. Sometimes, especially when it comes to very complex ones, you have to kind of take the time to sit by yourself and work through that. Bearing that in mind, pair programming also has its massive advantages. So there tends to be kind of fewer and far between bugs, as you have a very constant kind of code review going on. You have two developers explaining their thought processes, explaining why they would do things in the way they do as they're doing it. This kind of leads to higher quality code and leads to, after you've completed the work, having not just one, but two developers that intimately understand how the code actually works. So I don't know about you, but a lot of the time when I'm looking at PRs, especially if there's no obvious red flags, all the builds pass, all the tests pass, I tend to kind of approve PRs without fully understanding, how the code actually works line by line. And pairing in this fashion on kind of complex things will lead to having two developers that both understand it, and you'll have that kind of shortened feedback loop, especially for the junior developer, where they can kind of get reviews as they're doing it, rather than them working on the code, submitting a PR, and then getting comments. So during pair programming, I found that it's been a great way to kind of transfer coding best practices within our team, as opposed to kind of doing it retrospectively through a PR, as I said. And finally, one thing I really enjoyed about pairing is that it gave me a chance to have a lot of one-on-one time with different developers in our team. It allowed me to kind of understand how they work, what their thought processes are, their logic and reasoning, but also just getting to know them better, especially as a kind of junior developer joining a team. So if you couldn't tell, I'm a very big advocate of pair programming. So, to the senior developers, junior developers are not going to want to take up your time. Being the junior developer, I hate asking to pair. I feel sometimes it can be a bit of a nuisance. Will tend not to want to ask. So making it known that you're available and making it known that you're up for pairing and that you enjoy doing it and you see the benefit is really greatly appreciated by us. If you're if you're in the position where you're assigning work to junior developers, offering to pair, especially when you're kind of assigning complex work, even if your junior developers don't take it every time, the kind of offer is very appreciated and it doesn't go unnoticed. So a different type of programming that I hadn't heard of before I started my job was mob programming. So for those that don't know, Mobbing is essentially taking a group of developers into a room and working on a problem, working on a piece of code, where one person will sit and type, and the rest will be in a discussion of how they should implement that feature or fix that problem. In my team, I'm quite lucky to we have weekly 1-hour mob programming sessions. But we're not working on kind of production codes. The past kind of year, we've been doing a lot of, it started off, a colleague of mine was interested in how Twitter worked. So we have a Twitter clone reimagined as Scala. And we've kind of also looked into how Airbnb works in terms of microservices architecture. So doing this in this way and learning Scala in this way has let us explore a few different things. So we've had a look at different Scala libraries. So we've been using HTTP4S for our HTTP endpoints. We've also explored GraphQL endpoints using Sangria. And then we've also been using cats for our effect type. Sometimes I feel with my job, the kind of hardest part isn't actually the Scala. It tends to be the complexity of the domain that you're working in. So kind of learning about these different libraries and learning Scala without the kind of pressure of having to write production codes has been such a welcome break. And it's made it so much more enjoyable kind of learning Scala in this way without it always being towards a deadline or towards a Jira. So when you kind of join a company or a team as a junior developer, you tend to be joining places where the kind of scaffolding of your application is already up. You tend to be joining an application that's more mature than, so you tend to be joining a more mature application. And as a result, as a junior developer, you really miss out on the conversations about architectural decisions or kind of why things are done in the way that they are. It kind of ends up with you don't understand the kind of context or the history behind your application and what led to the decisions and kind of how it's structured. So to kind of combat this, during our mob programming session, we've been discussing different kind of software engineering patterns. So we've looked at microservices and we've looked at monoliths and kind of had a discussion about, when do you choose one over the other? And doing this has given me so much more context on what my application is and why it's structured in the way that it is. So, how have these opportunities come about for my team? So, we've regularly had interns over the kind of past 4 or 5 years. And we've had quite a lot of people join in the past year who don't actually have any Scala knowledge but are kind of Java developers. So we've had a lot of new people joining that have needed to learn Scala. And there was a kind of need to learn how do we best teach. I'm very lucky to work with very passionate Scala engineers and people that really care about teaching best practices. And these are the people who actually kind of set up these mob programming sessions. And we also do more formal weekly hour-long sessions of kind of Scala learning, not just discussing, not in like the mob programming style, but in a more kind of formal, being taught environment. So, as I said, mob programming naturally evolved from the Twitter clone, and then it led into, when we were asking questions about it, it led into having these discussions. I think it's a great way, if you have a side project, to not only have the benefit of being able to teach Scala in a very informal, relaxed way, but you also get the benefit of having a variety of experiences, a variety of ideas when you're doing it in a mob programming way. And it's also given us the space to not have to understand everything first time and not having the pressure of being seen to understand everything first time. It's also been great to have the kind of balance of a more formal learning environment. So when we kind of first started these, we had a look at kind of Pluralsight, online learning platform, and went through like different exercises and discussed them. We then moved on to doing leak code exercises and getting kind of feedback from the different developers on our team on how they would have done it versus what we did. And most recently, we've been doing live coding, where we've been understanding how Circe works and kind of implementing it from scratch and taking arbitrary type classes and generating JSON. So this is all very time dependent on how much flexibility you as a senior developer have. But implementing even any of these, even just saying, a small time commitment of I'm available to pair, is extremely beneficial to us. And you'll see that benefit when we're writing better codes day to day. So, mentoring and teaching is something I thought was very much reserved for people a lot further down their career than I am right now. And about 6-7 months ago, as I said, we have a lot of interns join. So we had a 6-month placement student join, and he was in a very similar position to what I had been a few years earlier. He had joined a new company, a new team, didn't know the language, didn't understand the stack. And at the start, when he joined, I ended up spending a lot of time kind of going through our code base with him, explaining how things work to him. And it was really beneficial for me to see, how much have I learned in this past 6 months, and it kind of forced me to solidify what do I actually understand and what do I need to work on. And then for him, he was able to kind of onboard and get taught by somebody who was a relative beginner, and it was a very non-intimidating way for him to start at the company. So my kind of advice to junior developers is really, when you get the chance to teach and when you get the chance to kind of share your knowledge with others, take it. It will help you grow massively. On the other side, to the senior developers, creating these opportunities for learning and community is what's led to me to becoming, or what helps me to become very productive very quickly. But it also kind of boosted my confidence in my ability to be a Scala developer. So again, to the senior developers, please consider how you can do this for your juniors, and see it as an investment into the kind of future code that they're going to write. It really has a huge impact on our learning and kind of at the very start of our careers. You really do have a very key role and impact, and I can tell you this for a fact that my experience would have been so different without the kind of very passionate and talented engineers that I work with. So, learning Scala has really been no easy feat. It's very much been a year of growth and new experiences, and there's been a few mistakes here and there. So to the junior developers, just starting out in Scala, I hope what I've said when put into practice will improve your learning experience and give you the comfort to know that you're not alone. Accepting that you'll make mistakes and learning from them is something that no developer should ever stop doing, and it's part and parcel of life as a developer. Get into the habit of telling the story of your problems. It will help you maximize the interactions that you have with senior developers. And finally, take those opportunities to connect with your peers, learn from them, but also take the opportunities to teach when you can. To the senior developers, I hope what I've said has given you a slight bit of insight into what it's like to learn Scala almost 20 years on from its inception. Allow us to fail, but help us to kind of grow from it and learn from it. Your knowledge and expertise is invaluable to us, so guide us and lead us to becoming better engineers is really what we need from you. And then, finally, you really have a key role in creating these great learning opportunities for developers, for junior developers. And as I said, it can be as simple and small a time commitment as saying you're available to pairing, all the way up to organising these kind of weekly meetings and space to teach. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my amazing team over the past year for all their support, especially to Nicola for encouraging me to apply to Scala Days in the first place. And I'd also like to say thank you to Scala Days for the opportunity to share my experience and recognising the importance of giving junior developers a platform to share. Thank you very much.